Welcome to Question It, the podcast where we rethink health, wellness, and personal growth. I'm Kevin, your host, chief inquisitor, and sometimes guinea pig, exploring fresh paths to a better life. Let's dive into today's episode and get started. Before we begin this episode, it's important to provide a strong disclaimer and trigger warning. The content of this episode includes discussions on sensitive and potentially distressing topics. These may include, but are not limited to, mental health struggles, emotional distress, trauma, or other challenging subjects. While these discussions are approached with care and compassion, they may be triggering for some listeners. If you find these topics difficult to hear or are feeling vulnerable, please prioritize your mental and emotional well-being. It's okay to pause, skip, or listen with support from someone you trust. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health challenges or emotional distress, help is available. In the U.S., you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. For international listeners, please visit befrienders.org to find resources in your area. This podcast is intended to foster understanding and reflection, not to cause harm. Thank you for taking care of yourself as we explore this challenging but important topic together. Once again, we're using Google's Notebook LM, the artificial intelligence, to try and help recap or summarize or provide a slightly different perspective on a topic that I've covered recently in a different episode of the Question It podcast. And we are tackling a difficult issue again, suicide and other destructive behaviors that are often attributed to mental health problems. But in this episode, we're going to explore how maybe it's not a mental health problem, but actually an emotional health problem. And there is a distinct difference between the two. And until we can really separate the two and explore them independently, even though they do interrelate, then by doing so, we can really help to address these destructive behaviors that are plaguing humanity really around the globe. So let's hear how the AI summarizes a previous episode and article that I wrote in the past.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And, today we're going to kind of dive into something that's really tough to talk about, and that's suicide. But we're going to do it a little differently.
Yeah, we're not going to just look at the numbers, which can feel very abstract and overwhelming.
Right. We're going to really try to understand it on a deeper level.
Exactly. And to help us with that, we're going to look at a blog post and a podcast episode by Kevin Strauss, who actually lost a childhood friend to suicide.
So this isn't just some theoretical discussion for him. This is something he's lived through and wrestled with personally.
You can really hear that pain and that struggle to make sense of it all come through in his podcast.
In the episode, he talks about how he and his friend used to play Dungeons and Dragons together, listen to Queen like they really shared a history.
Yeah, this wasn't just a statistic to him. This was someone who mattered, who he had real experiences with.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so important for us as listeners too, right? It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers, but behind every suicide is a real person with a story.
And a whole network of people who are impacted by that loss.
It makes you stop and think about the human cost of this issue.
Absolutely.
And, Kevin goes even further than just sharing his personal experience. He actually challenges the way we typically approach these issues.
Yeah.
He argues that our focus on mental health might be a little too narrow.
Yeah, he makes this really interesting distinction between mental health and emotional health.
Okay, so what does he mean by that?
Well, he defines mental health as more about our cognitive function. So things like our ability to focus, think clearly, remember things.
Okay, so like the mechanics of our brains.
Right, exactly. And then he defines emotional health as being more about the experience of love, connection, belonging.
So like the feeling side of things.
Exactly. And he asks this really thought-provoking question, which I think is so powerful. He says, if you had to choose between losing your ability to think clearly or losing your ability to feel loved and connected, which would you choose?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one.
It is, right? But I think most people would say that losing love and connection would be far more devastating than losing some cognitive function.
Totally. I mean, which one feels more fundamentally human?
Exactly. And Kevin's point is that a lot of the destructive behaviors we see, including suicide, aren't necessarily signs of a broken brain, but rather attempts to cope with deep emotional pain.
It's like we're trying to numb a wound.
Exactly. And we'll use whatever we can find to do that: drugs, alcohol, risky behavior, even things like overachieving or constantly seeking validation from others.
It's like we're trying to fill a void.
Right. And I think that's something most of us can relate to on some level. Haven't you ever used something to try and numb emotional pain?
Oh, absolutely.
We all have our ways of coping, and sometimes those coping mechanisms can become harmful.
And this is where Kevin's work gets really insightful. He talks about this subconscious equation that he thinks drives so much of our behavior. Feeling valued equals feeling loved.
Right, like it's this fundamental human need to feel valued by others, and that often gets tied up with our sense of being loved.
And when that need isn't met, it can really mess us up.
Yeah, it can lead to all sorts of problems, both for the individual and for society as a whole.
It makes me think of that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Oh, that's such a powerful quote.
If someone is deeply hurting inside because they don't feel loved or valued, that pain doesn't just stay contained. It often spills out in ways that can harm themselves and others.
And tragically, in some cases, that outward expression of pain can manifest as suicide. But Kevin doesn't offer any quick fixes or easy answers. In fact, he explicitly says there are no quick fixes or one-and-done solutions when it comes to health, wellness, or relationships.
I remember that line from his blog. It's so true, though, right? We live in a culture that's obsessed with quick fixes and easy solutions. But when it comes to complex issues like emotional health, there's no magic bullet.
Right. It's about the long game. It's about building healthy habits and creating a supportive environment.
He actually uses the example of smoking in his blog to illustrate this point. We all know smoking is harmful, but just knowing that doesn't automatically make people quit. It takes something more.
It takes a willingness to change, to do the work.
So if knowledge isn't enough, what is? How do we actually address this profound need for love and connection that Kevin is highlighting?
Well, that's a big question, and we're going to dive into that more in the next part of our deep dive. But one thing Kevin mentions that I think is worth exploring is this concept of the Uchi app.
Yeah, he talks about that in his podcast episode. What exactly is the Uchi app and how does it work?
So it's based on this idea of creating an uchiTribe, which basically means a group of people who are committed to showing up for each other in a really authentic way. And the app provides prompts and a framework to help people move beyond small talk and engage in conversations that foster genuine connection.
So it's not a magic bullet, but it's a tool that can help create the space for those deeper connections to form.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting because he ties this back to the idea of parents needing to model healthy emotional behavior for their children. He argues that if we want future generations to experience genuine connection, we need to start by showing them what it looks like.
And this goes beyond just telling kids to talk about their feelings, right? It's about actually demonstrating what it means to be emotionally open and vulnerable.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes that a key part of this is acknowledging and validating children's feelings rather than shaming, judging, or dismissing them.
So it's about creating a safe space where kids feel comfortable expressing their emotions without fear of being shut down or criticized. That makes a lot of sense. But how does this tie back into the idea of the Uchi app and fostering deeper connections?
Well, think about it. If parents are actively modeling those behaviors, being vulnerable, expressing their emotions in a healthy way, and truly listening to their children, they're essentially creating their own little uchiTribe within their families.
That's a really interesting connection. So the Uchi app is almost like an extension of that idea, providing a framework for those same kinds of conversations to happen outside of the family unit.
Exactly. And that's why Kevin sees it as a potential tool for addressing this epidemic of loneliness and disconnection that he believes is at the root of so many of our societal problems.
This is really powerful stuff. It's making me rethink the way I approach my own relationships and the messages I'm sending to the people around me.
I think that's the first step towards creating real change, becoming aware of our own patterns and the ways we might be contributing to or perpetuating this cycle of disconnection.
Yeah, it really does make you think differently about things, you know? Like maybe instead of just focusing on fixing mental illness, we need to be thinking more about how to build these deeper connections that can actually prevent these problems in the first place.
Yeah, it's like a total shift in perspective, right? Like, what if we treated emotional health with the same level of importance as we treat physical health?
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about Like, imagine a world where everyone felt truly seen and heard and valued.
Yeah, it sounds almost utopian, but I think that's what Kevin is pointing to with this idea of the uchiTribe and those moments of genuine human connection.
It really does take a village, doesn't it? Like, we need each other to thrive.
And it's not just about having people around. It's about having those deep, meaningful connections where you feel truly understood and supported.
So it's not just about quantity. It's about quality.
Exactly. And, going back to Kevin's story, what really stood out to you in terms of concrete things we can do to build those kinds of connections?
I think the thing about parents acknowledging and validating their children's feelings was really powerful. Like, it's so easy to dismiss kids' emotions, especially when they seem irrational or overblown to us as adults.
Oh, totally. I mean, think about how many times you've heard someone say, oh, they're just being dramatic, or they'll get over it.
Yeah, exactly. But Kevin's story really highlights how those seemingly small interactions can have a huge impact on a child's development.
It's like those messages get internalized and they can shape how we view ourselves and our relationships for years to come.
So it's like we need to reframe how we think about kids' emotions. Instead of seeing them as a problem to be fixed, we need to see them as an opportunity to connect.
Yeah, like even if the emotion itself seems irrational, the underlying need for connection is very real.
It's a tough one, though, isn't it? Like, as a parent, it's so easy to get caught up in trying to control our kids' behavior, especially when we're stressed or overwhelmed ourselves.
Absolutely. It's a constant learning process. And it's important to acknowledge that parents aren't superheroes. We can't single-handedly prevent every bad thing from happening.
But we can create a more supportive environment for our kids.
Exactly. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to just acknowledge their feelings, even if we don't agree with them.
So instead of saying, don't be sad or you shouldn't feel that way, we could try saying something like, I see that you're really upset right now. It's okay to feel that way.
Exactly. It's about validating their experience without trying to change it or fix it.
It sounds like a lot of patience, though.
It does, but I think it's worth it. Those small moments of connection can make a big difference in a child's life.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about parents and kids, but I think these principles apply to all of our relationships, right? Like with our partners, our friends, even with strangers.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating a general sense of empathy and understanding in all of our interactions.
I'm curious, though, you mentioned this Uchi app that's designed to foster deeper connections. Do you think it's really possible to build those kinds of connections through an app?
That's a good question, and I think it's important to acknowledge that technology can be a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, it can definitely contribute to feelings of isolation and disconnection, but on the other hand, I think it can also be used to facilitate connection in ways that wouldn't otherwise be possible.
So it's not about replacing face-to-face interaction, but about supplementing it.
Exactly. Like, think about it. For people who are shy or introverted or who live in remote areas, technology can provide a lifeline to the outside world.
And even for people who have strong social networks in real life, an app like Uchi could provide a framework for having those deeper, more meaningful conversations.
Right, because sometimes it's hard to just spontaneously have those kinds of conversations. You need a little structure or a prompt to get things going.
So it's like a catalyst for connection.
Exactly, and I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about feeling good or having warm, fuzzy conversations. There's actual scientific evidence that shows how important social connection is for our overall health and well-being.
Oh, really? So it's not just touchy-feely stuff. It's actually good for us.
Yeah, totally. Like, studies have shown that people who have strong social connections tend to live longer. They have lower rates of depression and anxiety. They even have stronger immune systems.
Wow. So it's like a superpower.
Kind of. And there's also a growing body of research that shows how important social connection is for cognitive function as we age. It's like a protective factor against dementia and other age-related cognitive decline.
So it's good for our brains, too.
Exactly. And I think it all circles back to Kevin's point about the importance of creating a culture of connection starting from a young age.
Yeah, like if we can teach kids how to build and maintain healthy relationships, that's going to have ripple effects throughout their lives.
Absolutely. And it's never too late to start. Even if we didn't have the best role models growing up, we can still learn how to connect with others in a more authentic and meaningful way.
But what about people who are struggling right now? Like, what if they're feeling really isolated and disconnected and they don't know where to turn?
That's a really important question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's okay to ask for help. There are resources available like crisis hotlines, therapy support groups, even just talking to a trusted friend or family member.
Yeah, it's so easy to feel like we have to go through things alone, but that's just not true.
And I think one of the most powerful things we can do for each other is to just listen without judgment, to create that space where someone feels safe enough to share their struggles.
Yeah, it's about being that uchiTribe for each other.
Exactly. And, one thing that Kevin mentions in his blog that I think is worth highlighting is the idea that sometimes even unintentional parental neglect can contribute to these feelings of isolation and disconnection.
So it's not always about abuse or intentional harm, but about those subtle ways that parents might dismiss or invalidate their children's emotional needs.
Right. Like it could be something as simple as constantly telling a child to toughen up or stop crying.
Or it could be more about a general lack of emotional attunement and responsiveness.
Exactly. And those patterns can have a lasting impact on a child's sense of self-worth and their ability to form healthy relationships later in life.
So it's like a cycle that gets passed down through generations.
Yeah. And it can be really hard to break, but I think the first step is awareness. Just recognizing that our own childhood experiences might be influencing how we parent our own children.
And then it's about making a conscious effort to do things differently.
Exactly, like to be more present, more attuned, more responsive to our children's emotional needs.
It's not easy though, is it?
No, it's not, but I think it's one of the most important things we can do for our kids and for society as a whole.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about the importance of emotional health, the power of connection, the role of parents in modeling healthy behavior, and the resources that are available for people who are struggling.
And I think the key takeaway here is that we all need connection. We all have the capacity to give and receive love, and that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference in the world.
And that's a really hopeful message to end on. So we've really gone deep on this, haven't we? I mean, starting from Kevin's story and, really looking at not just suicide itself, but like the roots of it all.
Yeah, we've talked about emotional health, that feeling of being valued and loved and how important that is, and, how parents can really help or hurt that in their kids.
It's heavy stuff for sure, but I don't know, there's something about this conversation that feels hopeful too,
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, Kevin's story is so powerful because it really shows us that we're all connected, like what we do or don't do can really impact the people around us.
And that brings us back to that idea of the uchiTribe.
Yeah.
Right? Like creating that space for deeper conversations and actually putting in the effort to build those connections that can really make a difference.
It really does take a village, doesn't it?
Totally. Like we all need each other to thrive.
And it's not just about being around people. It's about having those deep, meaningful connections where you feel truly understood.
It's not just quantity, it's quality.
Exactly. And going back to Kevin's story, what really stuck with you in terms of things we can actually do to build those kinds of connections?
I keep thinking about that point about parents acknowledging and validating their kids' feelings. I think that's so huge.
It is, and it's something that's so easy to overlook,
Especially when you're in the thick of it as a parent. And your kid is having a meltdown and it seems completely irrational.
Oh, totally. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say like, oh, just ignore them. They're just trying to get attention.
Right. But Kevin's story really shows us that those little interactions, those moments where we dismiss or invalidate a child's feelings, they can have a big impact.
Like it's not just about that one moment. It's about the message that sends over time, like my feelings don't matter or it's not okay to feel this way.
So it's like we need to reframe how we think about kids' emotions. Instead of seeing them as a problem to be fixed, we need to see them as an opportunity to connect.
Exactly. And even if the emotion itself seems crazy, the underlying need for connection is very real.
It's tough though, right? Like as a parent, it's easy to get caught up in trying to control your kid's behavior, especially when you're stressed.
Totally. It's a constant learning process.
And, it's important to remember that parents aren't superheroes. We can't prevent every bad thing from happening.
Right, but we can create a more supportive environment for our kids.
So what does that look like, practically speaking? Like, what are some things parents can do?
Well, one of the simplest things is to just acknowledge your child's feelings, even if you don't agree with them.
So instead of saying, don't be sad, or you shouldn't feel that way, you might say something like, I see that you're really upset right now. Mm-hmm. It's okay to feel that way.
Exactly. It's about validating their experience without trying to change it or fix it.
It sounds like it takes a lot of patience.
It does, but I think those small moments of connection can really add up over time.
And it's not just about parents and kids, right? These principles apply to all of our relationships.
Absolutely, with our partners, our friends, our colleagues, even with strangers.
It's about cultivating that sense of empathy and understanding in all of our interactions.
Exactly. And something I've been thinking about is that maybe one of the reasons why that Uchi app is so intriguing is because it gives us a framework for having those deeper conversations.
Like it provides a structure and some prompts to get things going?
Right, because sometimes it can be hard to know where to start or how to move beyond small talk.
So it's like a tool that can help us connect more intentionally.
And, there's actually a lot of research that shows how beneficial social connection is for our overall health and well-being.
Really? So it's not just touchy-feely stuff. It's actually good for us physically.
Yeah, like studies have shown that people who have strong social connections tend to live longer, they have lower rates of depression and anxiety, and they even have stronger immune systems.
Wow, that's amazing.
And there's also evidence that suggests that social connection can help protect against cognitive decline as we age.
So it's good for our brains too.
Exactly. And I think it all comes back to creating that culture of connection that we've been talking about, starting with ourselves and rippling outward to the people around us.
And remembering that we're all in this together.
Absolutely. We all need connection. We all have the capacity to give and receive love. And even small acts of kindness can make a big difference in the world.
So to our listeners, I want to leave you with this question. What's one small step you can take today to foster more connection in your own life? It could be reaching out to a friend, offering a helping hand to a neighbor, or just really being present with the people you love.
Because every act of connection matters, no matter how small.
And remember, you're not alone. We're all in this together.
Hopefully from this deep dive using Google's Notebook LM, we can see how there really is a distinct difference between mental health and emotional health, and how when a person's basic human needs are not being met, it causes pain. And that pain, how we try to deal with that pain is through our behaviors. And one of those behaviors, among others, is suicide or gun violence or drug and alcohol misuse or food or athleticism or seeking power and money and status. These are all ways that we try to compensate for our deep emotional pain. And I realize that can be very triggering to people because I'm tapping right into their pain right now. If a person didn't feel the love that they needed, especially in their early childhood, then they can get very angry and upset by that right now. And that's not my intention, but hopefully recognizing that it is triggering, that this conversation is triggering, hopefully that helps provide insight and a different perspective to understanding that really it's the feelings, it's the emotions that are being triggered, and it's that deep pain from way back in our past that is being triggered. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope this provides an alternative perspective that can really make our lives, humanity's lives, easier and happier going forward. I think that if we can really embrace this approach, then we can all really globally live peacefully, more peacefully, and really help our fellow humankind and the planet as well. So please join this episode's uchiTribe. That's a private group and it's free to join. We accept up to 9 other people, and then I'm the 10th person, and we can answer some questions, have some deeper conversation, and really explore how this idea of emotional health impacts our lives and how it's different from our mental health. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Question It. Remember, growth happens outside your comfort zone, so keep experimenting with life and embracing change. If you enjoyed this episode, please connect with me in the show notes, leave a 5-star review on the platform of your choice, and please join this episode's uchiTribe to dig into deeper conversation with me and fellow listeners. Until next time, peace, love, and connect.